I'd like to call this meeting, this work session meeting of the Festus City Council to order. If the clerk would please note the attendees.
I'll call this work session to order at 6 p.m. on April the 8th, 2021. For the purpose of this work session is for the compliance of the Missouri Sunshine Law presented by Casey Lawrence.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's presentation on the Missouri Sunshine Law. I know that time is one of our more precious commodities, and spending an entire evening learning about the Sunshine Law is maybe not the first thing on your list of things to do, but we really do appreciate that you came out tonight to hear this presentation. I do want to go ahead and give a quick disclaimer before we start. If anyone does find out if the tie is broken now that we're at the top of the 8th with the Cardinals game, please feel free to let us all know. I will take a pause for that moment, I promise. But on to my real disclaimer for the presentation. Okay, hold up. There we go. For the real disclaimer, I have to tell you a very important thing. I am not an attorney. I handle education and outreach. I handle records. I'm an analyst for the office, but I cannot give you legal advice. Legal advice has to come from your attorney. The Missouri Attorney General's office give legal advice to entities that are not our clients. So our client agencies are the state agencies. So City of Crystal City, City of Festus, you're not considered clients of the Missouri Attorney General's office, so we can't give you legal advice. So some questions tonight might be answered with what can start to feel like an annoying phrase when I say things like, I'm sorry, that's legal advice. You'll have to go to your attorney, but we have to respond that way. We just can't give advice. And again, I'm not an attorney, so I can't give that type of advice. What we're talking about are practices, procedures, things that you can do to make sure the Sunshine Law is implemented in a way that works for staff, works for elected officials, meets the requirements of the statute, and then also works for your constituents as well. So we're trying to get all of those different moving parts, get them all met together in the same statute. Okay, so the Missouri Sunshine Law is applicable to public governmental bodies. I think we can all agree that the City of Festus and the City of Crystal City are both public governmental bodies, but the statute does define that. It's in section 610.010 part 4. And you'll notice I bracketed page numbers on the slides. It'll be in the bottom right-hand corner. Those page numbers do correspond to your nicer looking Sunshine Law booklet. I'm afraid mine gets a little ragged as I travel. It's any legislative, administrative, or governmental entity created by constitution or statutes of the state of Missouri, or by order or ordinance of any political subdivision or district. So that also brings us to public governmental bodies as subcommittees. So a lot of cities and counties will create these subcommittees. They'll ask a few of the council members to, put together a proposal, or a few council members to, look into a possible purchase for the city. These types of subcommittees are also generally considered public governmental bodies in their own right. So you need to make sure that the rules you would follow for the city are also followed for these smaller subcommittee units as well. So again, that statutory language is in part 4, but you'll have to go down a little bit. It's in section E as in elephant. And it actually just a bit longer than the original definition, where it talks about the committees being appointed by the direction of the original public governmental body. Okay, so now that we've established the reason that we're all here, public governmental bodies have to follow the Sunshine Law, we're going to break it into 2 parts. So Missouri Sunshine Law covers public meetings and public records. We're going to start with the public meetings section first. Then we're going to give everybody a chance to ask questions about public meetings. And then we'll go on and talk about public records and do another question and answer session after that. For those of you who are not currently with us in Crystal City, please speak up and let us know if you have a question at any time. I'm afraid your picture on my screen is quite small, so I doubt I will be able to see your hands being raised. So feel free to interrupt me if you need to. This is a cozy enough group that we don't have to always wait till the end to answer questions. So a public meeting is defined again in section 610.010. That's where all definitions for the statute are located. Any meeting of a public governmental body at which public business is discussed, decided, or public policy is formulated. These can happen a lot of different ways. I think over the last 12 months, we've all realized that there are multiple ways for a meeting to be held. You can have a meeting in person, like we're having here. We have the council at one end of the room. We have chairs set up for the public to come in and sit in and watch what's going on. Or we can have a meeting via electronic communication. This is one that I like to warn cities about because sometimes it does become an issue. You can also have a meeting via conference call or an online chat or internet message board. Now, online chat and internet message board are the terms that are used in the statutory language. I'm not sure I've been on an internet message board in a while. So some of our technology has changed a bit since the legislation's been written, but we do have those online meetings. The term public meeting will also include a public vote of all or a majority of the members of a public governmental body. I like to point this out because sometimes the term public vote isn't the term that's used, but it seems to be what's implied. So for example, my favorite phrase that I've ever heard to describe a vote was, oh, we didn't vote, we just took the board's temperature on an issue. Well, if you took the board's temperature and then city staff went and acted on the decision made by the board after their temperature was taken, it kind of seems to be a vote. So if you get everyone together or you have that email or you have that text message where you make a decision and that decision basically leads to an action, you might want to look at that as a possible vote. You know, are you purchasing something? Are you making a decision about personnel? Is anything you're deciding right now going to affect your city clerk's, job on Monday when she comes back in? Is she going to have, a stack of tasks to do based on, that decision that's being made? So that vote can be considered a meeting. And you want to make sure that if you're having a meeting that you provide, public notice that's 24 hours in advance. We'll go through all of those requirements, but you need to make sure you're treating it the same way. Okay, so what's not a meeting? We talked about what is. What wouldn't be a meeting? It's not going to include any time you have an informal gathering of a quorum of your officials, especially when that informal gathering is not set up to try and avoid the purposes of the Sunshine Law. I have to underline this section because there was an unfortunate circumstance where a public governmental body was breaking themselves down into groups of less than a quorum with the specific purpose of trying to avoid the Sunshine Law. They had been meeting in small groups of 2 and 3. That was less than a quorum for their board. They were taking little mini votes and then adding it all together and then passing bills that way. That's still trying to avoid the Sunshine Law at that point. Now, if you are all together for the 4th of July picnic, or you all happen to be together because it's, the opening day for the high school, that's going to be one of those social events. Please try and make sure that a meeting doesn't break out at the 4th of July picnic. Don't ruin a perfectly good picnic that way. So just make sure that when you are all gathered together, that you try not to discuss that public business and decide things and formulate public policy. The Sunshine Law only talks about 2 types of meetings. It talks about open meetings and it talks about closed meetings. Those are the only 2 things that are defined in the statute. Now, we know that there are other terms that are used by public governmental bodies. In fact, tonight we used the term work session. A work session is going to be a term that is defined by your entity. It is not defined in statute. So your work session, you will still have to tell the public, is it an open session? Or if it's a closed session, tell them why it's closed, because there's not going to be any statutory background explaining to them what a work session is. Same for things like executive session or budget prep, things like that. Those are going to be internal terms that are very helpful to both you as the council members, to the staff, to the constituents. You know, if everybody knows what that term means, that's important, but they're not defined in statute. So you need to make sure you're covering that on your end. Public meeting notices. Every meeting you have has to have a public meeting notice. It has to be posted 24 hours in advance of the meeting, exclusive of weekends and holidays. So if you're going to have a meeting on the Tuesday after Memorial Day, you're going to have to post that meeting notice by the Friday before, because Monday doesn't count. It's a holiday. Saturday and Sunday don't count. They're holidays. So if the meeting's going to be at 6 p.m. on that Tuesday, then the meeting notice needs to be posted no later than 6 p.m. on the Friday before. So the statutory requirements for a meeting notice are found in section 610.020 part 1, and it's that you have the time, the date, the place, the tentative agenda, which must be reasonably calculated to inform the public of the matters to be considered, and the mode for the meeting. So if the meeting will be conducted by telephone or electronic means. So if anybody had a Zoom meeting during some of the shutdowns for COVID, you would have needed to tell people that on your meeting notices. Now, under tentative agenda, I do want to pause for just a second. There's that little sub bullet point on the slide. That's all the statute has to say about how the agenda has to be crafted. It is both short, but also very broad. So you do want to make sure you take that into consideration when you are drafting your agendas. It has to be reasonably calculated for the public. So for example, there was a case, it only made it to circuit court, so there is no case law on this particular matter. But what happened was a city council kind of changed over after a local vote, like the one we had this week. And when the city council changed over, they wanted to hire a new attorney. They put up the meeting notice that said, hire new attorney. So the public attended. They wanted to, see what was going to happen about hiring a new attorney for the city. The issue was when the public arrived at the meeting, it turned out that the city had already submitted an RFP, had only submitted the RFP to one law firm in the area, had already received a response from the law firm, and the woman who was going to represent the law firm was already there in attendance at the meeting because she expected to go ahead and be setting up with the council by the end of the meeting. So the body had actually gone a lot further in the process than what the public knew about. And that was something that the judge then told them, no, sorry, that's not going to stand. Go back, try it again. And a judge can do that if a case is ever brought to their attention. A judge can overturn a decision that's been made in the meeting. Oh, for a second there, I thought it was the cops. 3-1? Oh, okay. Well, there we go. I have a quick notice example for the header. So what we like to see, you have your notice for your public meeting and what body it is. So if you have it for the city council, you announce it for the city council. If it's for the Parks and Rec Board, you announce that it's for the Parks and Rec Board. 6 p.m. on Tuesday, give the date. I like to give the name of the building and the address, but that's me. We moved around a lot when I was younger. My dad was in the military. So sometimes when you'd get to a town and people would just tell you, oh, we're going to meet at such and such building. I didn't know what that was. I needed an address. I needed to know where to go to find the meeting. So we often say, write your agendas for somebody who's from out of town. Write your agenda for somebody who just moved to your community and may not know what the certain buildings are called or if you're going to have it at, the park, that they know which park is generally deemed the park. Just that extra bit of information usually doesn't take too much time to add to the agenda, but gives the constituents a lot more to work from. And then I also noted that if you're going to have your meeting via Zoom, make sure you note that on the agenda. Give people a way to attend that meeting. So meeting agenda examples, you're going to have your usual call to order. Some cities have the Pledge of Allegiance, approval of the meeting agenda, your roll call, and then usually you approve the previous meeting's minutes. These are all just sample things that are on most of your agendas. You can also take note, though, that your closed session meeting minutes can be approved in your open session meeting without opening up the closed meeting minutes. You don't have to then automatically make them open to the public just because you approved them at the public meeting. You're still allowed to keep them closed because the content is still generally closed. I mean, if you're still talking about a personnel matter, that personnel matter is still a closed record. So here's some examples. On the left side of the screen, you have kind of a brief description, right? You have unfinished business of city budget and park permits. Under new business, you have sunshine law policy and city hall parking lot. Okay, I mean, that tells people what you're going to be discussing mostly. But then you can see a revised version on the right-hand side of the screen under unfinished business, city budget, police department proposal for 2022. Okay, now that might pique certain people's interest. Are you concerned that perhaps the police department in your town doesn't have enough in their budget? Or are you concerned that more of their budget be spent on personnel versus material? Those are different things than if you show up and they're talking about, the budget for the new ball field at the park. The new ball field at the park is important, but it may not be what you wanted to show up for. So just a little extra detail can be really helpful. And park permits. Well, park permits may not be an issue for you if we're just talking about like the soccer league getting the fields on, Saturday mornings in the spring or something like that. But if the park permits are for New Year's Eve fireworks shows or a possible beer garden or something, that might be something that certain people are interested in. So providing just that little bit more detail, again, we're talking about maybe 30 more characters on the agenda, but it does kind of flesh it out and provide a lot more detail for the public. Same thing under new business. If we're just talking about sunshine law policy, are you just putting out a revised one? What's going on? Approving a whole new one? Well, maybe I want to see the sunshine law policy. Maybe I want to get a copy from the clerk. The city hall parking lot, well, what are you doing with it? In this case, drafting an RFP for the parking lot to be resurfaced. So this type of detail is really helpful to constituents. It's really helpful to let them know whether or not they should be attending these meetings because it may be an issue, kind of close to their heart. Okay, so tips for posting meeting notices. You will notice there is no citation of law in the bottom right-hand corner. These are things that we have found to be very useful, but these are not statutorily required. These are just things that kind of make everybody's life a little easier. Try to post your meeting notices and agendas in areas that are accessible to the public even after business hours. So if you have like that nice glass front door, if you can tape it to the inside of that door, then that means the public can come by and look at that even after the office is closed. So for example, I only work 3 blocks from the Jefferson City Hall, but they close at 5 and the AG's office closes at 5. So if I want to go look at the agenda and I don't run down there over my lunch break, then I have to, wait until the next day. I have to try and go in when the city hall is open because they're closed at the same time I'm out of work. So if they post it on a nice glass door or they put it online, I'll be able to see it. So another option is to consider posting more than one physical notice. For entities that have like a municipal building, as well as a city hall, fire department, police department, sometimes they'll send out the notice electronically to, the staff in all of those buildings, and those staff can also print a copy and post it as well. then you're ensuring that as constituents interact with their governmental agencies throughout the day or the week, they have access to that online posting. You can also create an electronic notice that would be posted online. I know that was really helpful for a lot of entities, especially when they were having online meetings during COVID, that people were able to access those meeting notices individually and at home. I know there for a while, people really didn't want to gather in like a large group outside of a door, all looking at the same meeting notice. You can also include the date and time the notice was posted actually on the paper. So what I've seen a lot of clerks do is they'll go through with like a different colored pen and do like a memo signature and a date for when they posted on the door. Again, this isn't perfect. It's not going to be absolutely precise, but it's very helpful. You've told the public that here, I, Casey Lawrence, posted this agenda. It was at 6:25 in the evening, and it was on April the 8th. It's great to have. Not everybody will be impressed by it, but it is helpful. And try to include the name and contact information for your custodian of records on the agenda or the notice somewhere. That's really helpful in case anyone wants to get a hold of information that you'll be discussing at your meeting. So if somebody wants to take a look at the sunshine law policy or take a look at that RFP for resurfacing the City Hall parking lot, those are documents that would generally be open to the public, so they may want to get a copy of them. Having quick contact for the custodian of records can be really helpful for that. Okay, back to statutory language, because it's very nice to have the statutory language backing you up in your decisions. So statutory requirements now for recording a meeting. If you are having a public meeting, the body shall allow members of the public to record the meeting. They can have audio and video recordings. You can set up rules as the city for how you want those audio and video recordings to take place. If you would prefer that, all video cameras be set up on that wall so they're out of the way, close to plugins, nobody trips over wires, things like that. If you'd like to have people who are, audio recording, maybe setting up here closer, to the board members so they're getting a clear recording, that can be nice. But whatever you do, if you've got it in policy, you probably want to make it available. So again, the Sunshine Law says you can create a policy. I've seen where it's really helpful, where some cities have actually posted that policy inside their boardroom. So inside like a room where you have your meetings, a lot of times, you can just go ahead and put that policy up for people and say, okay, if you want to audio or video record, here's our policy. Here's how we're going to do this. If you are having a closed meeting, so you all go into closed session, you either retire to a different room or the public steps out in the lobby, however it works for you all. When you have a closed session, no one can record that closed session without prior permission from the body. So you all have to give permission for that closed session to be recorded. If you are ever found to be recording a closed session meeting without permission, you can be found guilty of a Class C misdemeanor. I used to never include this in my presentations because it never came up. It was just never one of those issues that was ever a problem until we had one city council where one member did record everyone in closed session and then made the recording available to the media. And it caused such a huge rift in the council and in the town. And it took them, I think they're kind of still getting over it. So it does cause a big issue. So you want to make sure that people are aware of this. If you're going to record, make sure you go ahead and ask permission and you get that vote from the body. Okay, so closed meetings. Closed meetings are only to be closed to the extent allowable by law. So to the extent allowable by law is nice language that says only for the reason you gave. So there are 24 separate reasons that you can close a meeting listed in the Missouri Sunshine Law. They're in section 610.021, and it takes about 5 different pages. 35 through 39 has all of those different closures. Now, these are some common exceptions. 1 is for legal, 2 is for real estate, 3 and 13 are for personnel, 11 is for bid process, 12 is for sealed bids and contracts, and 17 is for any auditor work product or auditor conversation. Now, while these are the most common, it's really not helpful to have that boilerplate language at the bottom that just lists all of these. It says, well, if something comes up, we may go into closed session. And the issue with that is if you put these on every single agenda, then no one knows what you're really going into closed for. Your constituents just see it and kind of assume, oh, they're going into closed session again. Who knows what they're going to talk about? Because that's a lot of area right there. That's a lot of territory to cover with those statutory regulations. Plus, I often get at this point in time, somebody usually raises their hand and says, but what if it's an emergency? And if it's an emergency, that's fine. If you need to add anything to your agenda because of an emergency, if it is impossible or impractical to push it off to another meeting, that's covered in section 610.020 part 4, where it talks about what to do in an emergency situation. That you try to post the agenda as fast as you can, that you try to let people know why you couldn't have this reason. You have to put that reason in your meeting minutes. So there are things you can do. And we're talking about situations that would only pop up in the last 24 hours before your meeting. Anything else that happens before that 24 hours can go on your agenda just like normal. But anything that pops up in that last 24 hours, that's going to be your emergency situation. It's impossible or impractical to push this issue off to another meeting. There's also a common exception that I see, sub 14. Sub 14, it just says records which are protected from disclosure by law. This is not a catch-all. This is not an actual closure. This is just one part of the equation. This allows you to cite to another provision of law to close the meeting. So if you have HIPAA information, if you have Driver's Privacy Protection Act information, or if you are working with the local school board and they have student information that's protected by FERPA, you can use section 14 to then cite to a code of federal regulation and then close the meeting. This is not a catch-all. If this was a catch-all, it would be one of those exceptions that kind of swallows the rule. So it's not something that just closes whatever you want. It has to be used with something else. So that's a common issue we see on meeting agendas and closed records notices, is that they try to use section 14 all by itself. That's not really plausible. Then there's closed meetings, the process. The process is covered in section 610.022. It requires an affirmative public vote of the majority of a quorum of the public governmental body. And in the vote, you have to reference the section of 610.021 that allows you to close the meeting. I've actually seen votes that said, well, our attorney says we have to go into closed session now, so everybody needs to go to the lobby. It's not a vote. You didn't cite to the right section, portion of law. These are things that have to be done. It has to be, I know it seems a little formal, but you have to let people know why you're closing. And then part 2 of this section requires a meeting notice to be posted with reference to a specific section of 610.021. So you'd have your meeting notice provided to everyone. You'd tell them we're going into closed session, and then you'd give the citation of law. So unfortunately, there is still some disagreement about section 610.022. I will go ahead and tell you this, that some attorneys read that as an or statement. You need one section or the other. Other attorneys and judges have read it as an and statement, that you always need both, because you also always need an agenda reasonably, written in a reasonable manner to inform the public of the matters to be considered, back from section 610.020. So without getting into any of the legal arguments, what we have seen be really helpful for cities is to go ahead and take both steps. Neither step is particularly onerous. It's not expensive. It's not time consuming. You can post the agenda and you can take a vote and you can go into closed session. And then it really doesn't matter if you have an attorney who would agree that you need both steps or would disagree that you need both steps. both of them would most likely be content with the fact that you've properly closed your meeting. I had a former chief counsel who called it the belt and suspenders method. You don't usually need both a belt and a pair of suspenders to hold up your pants, but if you have both, you're not going to embarrass yourself. So there, if you have both the agenda and the public vote, you're not going to embarrass yourself as the city. So a closed meeting requirement in 610.022 also includes that any meeting or vote that you have closed shall only be closed to the extent necessary for the reason that you announced that is justified. So if you are going to close your meeting to discuss a personnel matter, say, we don't think Casey answers her phone enough when she's on the road, and we want to talk about demoting her and not letting her go on the road anymore. So you go into closed session and you're going to talk about the behavior of Casey Lawrence. You get into closed session and you realize Casey doesn't have a work cell phone. How is she supposed to take work calls if she doesn't have a work cell phone? So instead, the conversation moves to, well, should we give individuals, under the director level, a cell phone? Now you've gotten into a topic that's no longer closed. If you're talking about giving, a whole slew of staff members cell phones, that's not individually identifiable personnel information. That's no longer talking about Casey's demotion. Yes, they're linked, they're connected, they're kind of wrapped up into each other. But this is where, somebody on the council might have to be the Debbie Downer and just kind of interrupt and say, hey, I don't think this is what we started talking about. This is a different topic. This is something we have to address at a different time. And this is something that might be actually an open topic for people. Trust me, anytime you talk about spending money, it's probably likely that it's an open topic that people want to know about. Another issue we have to talk about with closed meetings are location. So the statute talks about a public governmental body holding a closed meeting shall only close an existing portion of the building necessary to house the members, and you have to allow the public then to stay and then attend anything after the closed meeting. So you all are lucky, you have a nice lobby, you can have extra chairs anywhere you want to set up, or if you want to have the board kind of remove themselves to a different room and leave the constituents in here, that's all fine. What we don't want to see though is, the board saying, okay, well, we're going into closed, everybody else go home. Board has closed meeting, realize there's a few open meeting topics they still need to discuss, goes back into open session and continues to talk about things with the public none the wiser because they were told to go ahead and leave and they couldn't stay and attend any remainder of the meeting. So the next issue is objections. And this is really just for the council members. This is something that you'll have to kind of think about if you want to file an objection. A member of the public governmental body can object to closing any portion of the meeting. If you object to closing the meeting, your objection has to be entered into the meeting minutes. And any member who does object, if you are kind of overruled and everyone else votes to go into closed session, you would still be allowed to attend the closed session meeting. So if I decided that I object to going into closed session, everybody else overrules me, you can't make me, sit outside with the constituents because I voted against it. I still get to be there. I still get to, listen to everything, and I would still get to vote on anything in the closed session. Now, we're going to talk about meeting minutes. Meeting minutes are required for both open and closed sessions. I know that sometimes, it's sometimes assumed you don't have to keep meeting minutes for closed session, and that's not true. Every time you have a meeting, you have to have the date, the time, the place, members present, and members absent. This is the most commonly left off issue for meeting minutes, is you have to include any members who didn't show up. Because if you don't, when somebody else reads the meeting minutes, they don't know if the member just wasn't there, if the member's resigned, if the member was just, participating via phone and you just couldn't see them. You need to make sure you're listing how the members are there and if they're not going to be available. Record of all votes taken, including the vote to close, has to be included on your meeting minutes. So if it's a voice vote, you have to write it out as a voice vote, yay, nay. Or if it's a roll call vote, you have to list every single member and how they voted. What a lot of clerks do to make this a little faster is they have the vote sheets printed off beforehand, and they just have everybody's name printed off and they just write it into the fields. Okay, so that was meetings. Questions, concerns, spelling mistakes you found on the slides.
Casey, just real quick, since a lot of this electronic stuff has become a little more prevalent, I noticed it was mentioned on posting agendas online that it needs to be time stamped. Is that something that needs to be on the physical document, or is that can be something that's recorded within the kind of the realm of the website?
Okay, so the suggestion for the timestamp was just a suggestion that's not statutorily required. That's something that's just really helpful for like the posting of a physical notice, because you don't get an automatic audit trail. You are absolutely correct that when you post something online, you put it on your website, your Facebook page, your Instagram, you're going to get an automatic audit trail where it gives you the date and time that that's posted. So you're correct in saying that written date and time would be redundant at that point. It really is just a suggestion for the physical notices. And again, it is just a suggestion, not a statutory requirement.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Anything else? Yes.
If we have an online meeting, so if we publish a website for meetings being broadcast, do we have to provide the ability for anybody that's on that broadcast to participate?
Oh, public participation is not a matter that's covered by the Missouri Sunshine Law. So for those of you in Festus who may not have heard the full question, the question was, if you have an online meeting, do you also have to allow for the public to participate through that online channel? And the answer is no. That's something that's left up to each individual public governmental body, because it's not covered in the statute. And because it's not covered in the statute, we can't give you any sort of guidance or best practices on that. You're welcome. Okay, well, if there's no further questions on meetings, and of course, again, you can continue to ask questions. I won't just turn them down. We'll move on to responding to open records requests. So this is the other half of Missouri's Sunshine Law. An open records request can be sent to the city in any format. So if you want to submit a request to your city, you can send it in through an official request form. Like if the city has an online open records request form, you can fill that in and submit it. You can send a letter, you can send an email, that's also acceptable. And you can also make a request verbally by phone or by stopping by the office. You can submit a request just about any way you can think of. Here's a quick issue though with the verbal requests. It is difficult to follow up on those. You're not creating any audit trail for yourself as the requester, and the body doesn't get much of an audit trail either. Now, what I have seen some clerks take up is a kind of a form, like they might have a paper form at the front desk that allows people to kind of fill in an open records request form. Of course, constituents can choose not to and can just make an open records request, but then sometimes the city clerks or the city staff will then fill it in for them and say, okay, Casey Lawrence stopped by and she asked for the March meeting minutes when she came by on the 8th. That's really helpful for the city because it does provide that audit trail. It provides you kind of background of, okay, she came in on the 8th. Now we have to get the clock started on this open records request. So while the statute does allow you as a constituent to make an open records request verbally, I've always seen it be a lot more helpful if you go ahead and put it in writing somehow. And email's really nice because then you get to keep a copy for yourself. And you don't have to spend any money on postage or drive down and drop it off. The next thing you want to talk about is how you write your request. You can write your request in any format you like. There are no special words. There's no magic phrase. You don't have to say Sunshine Law. You don't have to say FOIA. You basically just have to write it in a way that any reasonable person would conclude that you are asking for records. It gets even more strict when you get to the state level. We have a separate requirement where even if somebody just asks about the existence of records, we have to assume it's an open records request and turn the records over. So if you get a request from somebody and they say, hey, I think at one point the city might have had a copy of a map for our subdivision, back in the 80s. Do you all have that? You kind of look at that and go, it sounds like they're kind of asking for a copy of a map. You might want to reach back out to them and see if that's really what they want. The person responsible for this is going to be your custodian of records. So, quick hand, who's our custodian? So your custodian of records is someone who's going to be very popular for your city, especially because the statute requires that their identity and location be made available upon request. So if anyone calls City Hall and says, hey, who's your custodian of records? You need to make sure that staff know who that is. One of the first stumbling blocks that I often see for an open records request is that someone will call and they'll call on their lunch break, right? So they're on lunch 12 to 1, but maybe the city staff who usually answers the phone is also on lunch from 12 to 1. So you have somebody else covering the phones, right? No big deal. Happens in offices all the time. But you have somebody else covering the phones who doesn't know that you have a custodian of records because that person never deals with it. So they get a call from a constituent. Hey, who's your custodian? I don't think we have one of those. Thanks, bye. It's a possible violation at that point because you haven't let them know who the custodian is. It's very important that once you appoint your custodian, you let all staff know who that is. Some cities have it on a little card at the front desk. So whoever's working the front desk knows how to answer the phone and say, yes, this is our custodian and how you can reach them. But it really is one of the first stumbling blocks that a lot of agencies have. Okay, I apologize for the text-heavy slide. This is on page 32, the full definition of a public record. In fact, this isn't the full definition. This is just the positive part of the definition. This is what is a public record. After the semicolon, the definition goes on and on about some things that may not actually be public records. That's important for you to read through, but for the purposes of the presentation, let's concentrate on the first sentence, and that is any record, whether written or electronically stored, retained by or of any public governmental body. So if you've received a letter from a constituent and it's in your possession, it's a public record. If you sent an email on your public email, it's a public record. Even if the email was just to your husband asking him to please pick up a gallon of milk before he comes home, it's still a public record because you used public resources to send it and it's now being stored on a public server. I have to admit, I had to have a very uncomfortable conversation with a few interns one year for a state agency because they didn't realize that their really fun chat function that they had was also being saved on a state server. So all of those cool things they said about the party they went to last night is now a public record. And I would have to turn it over if the press ever wanted. So it's very important to think about those resources that you're using when you create public records. Electronic transmission of messages. Now this is just for the board members. You are the special individuals who get kind of wrapped up in this 610.025. Electronic transmission of messages from a board member can be considered a public record if it is sent to a quorum of officials, including the sender, and discusses public business. So if you send an electronic message to a quorum of the officials and you're discussing public business, it is very likely that that transmission is a public record. And if it is a public record, it has to be transmitted either to your public device or the body's custodian of records. So if you are going to send out one of those emails, make sure you're copying the custodian of records on it so that she can go ahead and keep it stored and keep it organized so that if she has to provide records upon request, she has access to it and can search through it if necessary. There are two types of public records. Just like there are two types of public meetings, there are two types of public records, and they are open versus closed. Public in our terminology is of the public governmental body. So if it is a public record, it's a record of the body. It's a record of the city. It is open or closed based on its content. Sometimes people like to ask me this question: what about email? Is email open or closed? Well, that depends. What did you write in the email? If the email includes information about a personnel issue, again, I can't get a hold of Casey. She's not doing her job. Why isn't she answering the phone while she's on the road? You know, that might be a personnel issue, especially if you're sending that to the director of HR, and it might be closed. But if your email is simply, hey, I'm going to need the petty cash to go order, to go pick up the pizza for tonight's meeting, that's going to be likely an open record. They were both sent via email, so the media doesn't matter. It matters about the content of the record, and that's how you provide them to individuals. So another statutory requirement is that a body has to act on an open records request as soon as possible and no later than 3 days after the request was received by the custodian, and that is exclusive of weekends and holidays. Now that phrase, received by the custodian, is very important. Sometimes things get misplaced. Somebody sends a request for records to the Parks and Rec department because they want the Parks and Rec emails, but the Parks and Rec department doesn't have a way to search that, so they have to forward it on to the Custodian of Records. Well, until it gets to the Custodian of Records, that 3 days hasn't started. If it was with the Parks and Rec department and the Parks and Rec director received it in their email, they weren't in the office on Friday because it was the Friday before Memorial Day and they were taking vacation. They get back on Tuesday, they find it, they forward it to the custodian. Tuesday is when the custodian received that open records request. Because the Custodian of Records, while they are generally amazing people who can quickly respond to everyone and get everything found in the office, they're not magic and they can't fulfill a request they don't know about. So they do have to receive it. So practical tips, again, there's no statutory citation on this slide because these are just kind of helpful tips and tricks. Try to contact the requester in writing so that both parties have a copy of your response. So you as the body, try to make sure that when you reach back out to the requester, you have a copy of what you sent and you send it to them in writing so that they can have a copy to hang on to. I know it's really easy to pick up the phone and just say, hey, Jason, I got your request. It'll be ready tomorrow. Just stop by the office. That's great until you stop by the office tomorrow and I don't have it. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, Jason. I don't have any records for you. Nobody has any audit trail. Nobody can point to anything at that time. Include the date the response was sent. I don't know if we all get a little hampered by our email that when you send an email message, it's automatically got a date and time stamp on it. But my business writing teacher would be rolling over in her grave if she saw the number of letters that I received that do not have a date on them. Please date your business correspondence. It's very important, especially with the condensed 3-day time frame that we have to work with when it comes to the Sunshine Law. You have to make sure that you're telling people when you responded. Confirm the records that were requested. Dear Mrs. Lawrence, we understand that you're looking for meeting minutes for January, February, and March of 2021. You can request clarification at this point if necessary. Dear Mrs. Lawrence, we understand you're looking for meeting minutes from January, February, and March of this year. Did you only want meeting minutes of the council, or did you also want meeting minutes of the Parks, Planning and Zoning, and the Roads Commission? Did you want all of those as well? Some constituents may not realize that those are all extra meeting minutes that they could possibly receive and want to make a decision after they find out from you. Try to address any possible fees if you can do so. You may not actually know what the fees are going to be, but if you at least have your fee schedule ready, you can go ahead and provide it to them. Thank you for your request. Please note that any requests that are printed out will be 10 cents a page, plus $15 or $20 an hour, whatever your hourly rate is, for someone to look into this. DVDs will be, 75 cents. Things like that are always helpful to just go ahead and have, because then you can let a constituent know ahead of time that there's going to be fees involved, because some constituents may not realize that there could be a fee, and depending on the request, a hefty fee in order to fulfill the request. At this point, you would also want to confirm the way the records will be provided. I have had no end of complaints in this job, and I've been doing it for about 7 years, when somebody says, I stopped by to pick up my records and they told me they put them in the mail. I'm angry, do something about it. Well, wait 3 days, you'll get your records and then it'll be okay. But try to clarify that. Do you want to stop by the office? Do you want these by mail? Do you want us to email the records? These are all important things to go ahead and communicate with the constituent about. And then you have documentation that you reached out, you found out this information, and this is what you're working for, you're working towards. So this is all helpful, but again, not statutorily required, just things that we have seen kind of cut down on possible sunshine law complaints. What if you need more time to produce the records? What if the records request was quite large or asked for information that's really old and you're not going to be able to fulfill it in 3 days? This happens all the time. This is especially true of law enforcement records. Most of the time, your police officers can't immediately go back and start typing a report. They usually have to be out on patrol. So sometimes it can take a bit for those types of reports to be put together. If you need more time, you still need to contact the requester within those first 3 days. So you need to make sure that staff have the ability to kind of get those letters out, get those emails out, to make sure that they're reaching out to the requester to let them know that we've got it, we're working on it, but we can't quite get it to you now. If you do need more time, you will need to provide the requester with two specific pieces of information. And those are the estimated time of when the request can be fulfilled. And again, this is an estimate. We understand that sometimes those moving targets kind of get past what you estimated. But then also the reasonable cause for any delay. Thank you for your request for meeting minutes back to 2010. Please note that 11 years worth of records will take our office some time to put together, and we estimate that your request will be ready in 60 days. Something like that. Give the cause for the delay. 10 years or 11 years worth of records. Sorry, I still think it's 2020. I apologize. So 11 years worth of records, and that it's going to take you a while, and you expect to have it done in 60 days. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for that kind of response. Now, if it's such a large request that you can't figure that out in 3 days, go ahead and let the requester know. Hey, we got your request. You're asking for something from 1985. We don't know if we actually have that on site or if it's in off-site storage. Please give us 10 days and then we will get you a full estimate for what kind of records we think we're looking at that point in time. I know it seems like a very bureaucratic thing to do, to give somebody an estimate for an estimate, but it's just helpful to keep those communication lines open with the constituent. What if you don't have any records responsive to the request? This happens. Somebody may ask you for the meeting minutes from the December 2020 meeting. I apologize, the meeting from December 2020 was canceled and we decided not to reschedule it, and then we just had the January meeting. Do you want the January meeting minutes? Would be a reasonable response at that point, but you don't have to create anything that you don't have. You also may have destroyed records. Your records retention schedule is created for you by the Secretary of State's office. So the Secretary of State's office has 2 records divisions, one for the state, one for local agencies. The local governmental records division has a meeting every quarter to talk about their retention schedules, and all of them are posted online at sos.mo.gov. So you can always get those and download them. If you have destroyed records according to your retention schedule, that's fine. That's what you're supposed to be doing. However, you cannot destroy records after you have received an open records request for them. Does anybody remember a company called Enron and some things they did? Yeah, they had a really good records retention schedule and they implemented it the day the subpoenas showed up. So don't be like Enron. That's a very important rule. Make sure you're keeping track of those types of things, because if you've destroyed it, you let them know that you don't have a record responsive for them. There's also some case law for this. This is Jones v. Jackson County Circuit Court. This was back in 2005. The Western District ruled that the Sunshine Law does not require a government body to create a new record upon request, but only to provide access to existing records held or maintained by the public governmental body. I always look at this as like the list rule. I don't know what it is about the rise of those listicle articles on the internet, but very often you will get requests as a public governmental body for lists of things. For example, someone will send me a request for, I want a list of all of your complainants that are from Cole County and made complaints about entities in Cole County. I have no such list. I have no business purpose for such a list, but I do have all of those complaints. So if you would like the original complaints, I can give you all of those documents and you can feel free to create anything you want from them, but I don't have to create a list. Now, I have seen where some entities have created a list. What most often happens is there are 4 pieces of information that are available about employees. Okay, my step counter thinks my hand gestures are steps and I just completed for the day. So if you get a request for employee information, you are allowed to give out their name, their position, their salary, and their length of service. That's it. But there are rarely any HR documents that have just that information on the document. Or it may be 2 documents that have the information and a lot of redaction has to take place. So some cities create that as a list if they want to. So, don't show up tomorrow and say, hey, Crystal City, I heard you have this list about all your employees. You may not have it, but you can create one if you want to. This decision does not preclude you from creating such a list, but it means you don't have to create such a list. Any questions about that one? That one does tend to confuse some requests every once in a while. Then there's closed records. So just like closed meetings, you can close records. You can close them for the reasons listed in 610.021. And the same issue comes up with section 14. It cannot be used on its own. You must use section 14 with another provision of law. There are other state provisions and federal provisions that can be used to close records for a city. If you are closing a record, you need to be able to provide the requester with the citation of law that allows you to close it. We are the show me state for a reason. Don't just tell me it's closed and send me a letter. Tell me why it's closed. You also have to give a response that will generally describe the material that has been closed. This isn't actually as hard as it sounds. You give me a form, field 12 is redacted, right? It's blacked out, I can't see it. Dear Mrs. Lawrence, here's a copy of the form you requested. You'll note field 12 has been redacted. Field 12 contains a social security number and cannot be provided pursuant to, ... And you get the 610.021 sub 14, you have the federal citation, you've closed a social security number. Everybody understands that social security numbers are closed pieces of information. You've described the record, it's in a general manner, and you've let them know why it's closed.
You have to give them that level of detail. You just say there's
If you, I suppose you could say PPI, you may not have to tell them it's a social security number, but if you are citing to the specific federal code that discusses social security numbers, they're going to know it from that code citation. If you want to leave it more general as just PPI, then, I mean, if it's HIPAA, you've got citations, but that would definitely be a question for your attorney. That's going to get into some really nitty-gritty issues. Oh, I apologize, City of Festus, for those of you who may not have heard the original question. The question was, do you have to provide that level of detail when discussing the closed record? So the level of detail being social security number, could you just say closed personal information? And the answer is yes, to an extent. And of course, the favorite answer, please ask your attorney, because they'll of course want to weigh in on those specific types of questions. If you have a record that's responsive to the request but contains open and closed information, you do need to redact it. The redaction falls on the city's obligation. If you give out information that could have been closed, there is no clawback for that. There is nothing you can do about it at that point in time because 610.021 is what we consider a permissive statute. It allows you to close the records, but it does not require you to close the records. We had an unfortunate incident where a city clerk had simply taken a Word document, highlighted the text that needed to be closed, changed the text color to white, sent out the Word document to the requester. The requester got it. It was still in a format that could be manipulated, re-highlighted everything, changed the text back to black, and was able to read it all. They called us, asked if they could get the documents back, if we could assist, and we can't. Once that information's been made available, it's been made available, and it's assumed at that point that that was the decision of the body to give out the records. So do be very careful with your redaction. You can use everything from Adobe Pro to black permanent marker and then copy it on the copy machine so you can't just hold it up to the light and read through it. So then we have to talk about record format because it's discussed in the Sunshine Law. The Sunshine Law discusses format as electronic or paper. So when we talk about format, that's what we're looking at. If the requester didn't state a preference, you can provide the record in the format that you have the document. Now, I say that with a quick caveat. We all have constituents that may not have access to a computer or high-speed internet. If you have a constituent who does not have access to those resources and they need a record that you have electronically, you may want to consider going ahead and printing the record for them. Of course, charging them the 10 cents a page and the time it takes to print it, because just because you have the record electronically doesn't mean they'll be able to read it. So of course, we don't want to disenfranchise constituents who, may live further out than the rest of us and can't get high-speed internet enough to, load big pictures and maps and stuff on a record. So if you have records in electronic format, section 610.029 encourages you to provide access to the records in that format. This is kind of one of those statutes that just says, hey, by the way, if you have a giant database, don't print it off on 500 pages and then charge people for those 500 pages. Let them just see the database because it'll be cheaper and easier for everyone to make that transfer. So fees for open records requests. All public governmental bodies are allowed to charge fees for fulfilling an open records request. Fees have to be the lowest amount for search, research, and duplication time. And you can charge 10 cents a page for paper that is legal sized or smaller. If you are duplicating onto anything else, a DVD, an external drive, a thumb drive, you can charge the actual cost of that item. And if you are recreating things like photos, plats, large maps and things, go ahead and charge whatever that cost is. So if you have to take it over to the county office to use their big printer at the assessors group, tell them exactly how much it costs. This is what it's going to be to get this type of record. That's an exact cost you can pass on.
You said the assessor's office.
Oh, it's just an example. They have usually assessors' offices have the big plat printers.
Yeah, but that raises the question, do you don't have access there to UPS or something like that, or are they make records available?
No, I do believe that generally stores like UPS and FedEx and Staples and things who do take that, they do not retain those. Plus, they're a private company, so they don't fall under the same requirements for making their records available. It is one of those questionable things, though, that if you do have what would otherwise be closed information, you may not want to take it to a public store. But if we're talking about publicly available data that anyone could come down and request, it usually isn't a high risk issue to take it to a private company like that.
I have a question about the lowest cost.
Yes.
So if there's a request that just say Shelley has to do research on, we're supposed to charge the lowest cost with the lowest paid clerk in the office.
The lowest cost of the lowest paid person who could possibly do the job. So for example, if we have a, part-time clerk in our office that makes $15 and we have, a part-time, post office individual who makes $12, well, the kid working in the post office can't do this job. The person who makes $15, she's the lowest paid person who could actually do the job. This is kind of so you can't have your chief counsel stand there at the copy machine and have her making, $40 an hour to run the copy machine and then pass those costs off to the constituent. She's not the lowest paid person. She may be the individual who has to stay late and make the copies one night, but she's not the lowest paid person who could possibly do the task. So when you have IT have to do something, they have to run a search on your email or something like that, you would pay the lowest rate of the person in your IT group who could possibly have done that particular task.
Okay.
Yes.
Follow up on that. Where did you get a chief counsel that only makes $40 an hour? Because I have some words that I'd like to talk about with this guy here.
The state, the state has different compensation. We get Truman Day off, so that May holiday is very important to us. Or maybe you could just ask for Truman Day off. Maybe.
Casey, along that same line, there are certain documents that perhaps only the city administrator would have, and they're of course paid at a higher rate than a deputy clerk would be. Is that something you can take into consideration? I mean, there would be certain things perhaps that you wouldn't want the deputy clerk handling. Can that be part of the equation or not?
Yes, that can be part of the equation. We see that happen, especially in sensitive information. Say we're talking about law enforcement records that, only the police chief and the lead detective need to have access to. It's not just the file clerk that has access to them. So you have to pay their salary. Now, we do want to make sure that it's only for that specific set of records. It's not going to be, the director of financial services is the only person who has access to the financial records, because that's likely not true. There's likely, a clerk or, someone on staff who would also be able to make copies. It's when we see, that highest paid person be the only person who has access, and then we'll ask some questions. We do often follow up on these types of fee issues when constituents contact us. So it can be really helpful if you alert the requester prior to fulfilling the open records request of what the possible invoice could look like. Try to break it down for them. Now, the Sunshine Law requires statutorily that you tell them the cost in advance. So if it's going to be $50, you have to tell them that it's going to be $50. But it can be really helpful if you explain how you arrived at that $50. It's going to be 2 hours of work by somebody who makes $20 an hour. And then it's going to be $10 for the DVDs and the photos that we've printed off. So there you go. You've broken down the cost for them at that point. Again, that breakdown isn't statutorily required, but it does really help. We had a recent complaint where an entity was going to charge something like $4,932.67. And I was like, well, that seems like an oddly specific number. Could you please tell me how you arrived at that particular, equation? And so they did. They broke it down for us. But when you give someone, that large of a fee and it's a very precise number, you want to make sure you've got the math to back it up. Okay. Make sure that when you collect your Sunshine Law fees, that you are remitting that payment to the appropriate part of the office, that it's not just going into the petty cash box, that you actually make sure that your financial officer knows about this. I always mention this because I also train the auditors once a year. And when I train the auditors, I also train them to look for those fees. Make sure that if you have these requests that the body charged fees for, that you can track back those fees to the actual request. So they're doing it from one side, from the fee to the request. So you want to make sure you've got your documents all lined out for the request to the fees. I would hate to train one group of people and then not train the others on the same amount of information. Okay, yes.
So So in the statute, when it goes, talks about cost.
Yes.
I thought maybe this wasn't in there before, but it still is. It still talks about with the hourly fee for duplicating time not to exceed the average hourly rate of pay for clerical staff. So when
For the
you-
duplicating, yeah.
For just for the duplicating part, so just
Yeah.
for the copying and.
Standing at the copy machine, putting things on a
So
DVD.
that's still there for that.
Yeah. Now, I will go ahead. I mean, you're probably aware, but there's the Gross v. Parson case. The Supreme Court heard the Gross v. Parson case on February 3rd. So we are expecting a decision at some point in time. This is regarding an open records request that was made by a gentleman of the governor's office. The question was about the fees that were charged by the governor's office to fulfill this individual's request. It went through the circuit court, it went to the Western District. After the Western District decision, we took it to the Supreme Court. So we are expecting a decision on fees in the next few months. Once we get that, we'll also update our booklets and send out that as well. But we should be getting more information from the court on that differentiation between what's a duplication, what's staff time, what's research. I mean, they may, sometimes I hold it out and I'm like, oh, the Supreme Court's going to give us all this great information about the case, but sometimes they just answer like a very narrow question and then kick it back, which can happen. So hopefully we'll have more information on fees very shortly.
So you use the average for the duplication, the research time is the lowest possible.
Yeah, the lowest possible paid person who could actually do that research. And like was mentioned earlier, some research is a bit more sensitive than others, so. Okay. All right, so sunshine law policy. You are statutorily required as a public governmental body to have a sunshine law policy. It has to be written and it has to be made available upon request. We have a sample resolution. It is available at ago.mo.gov. It is very simple. It is name, address of custodian, schedule of fees, deadlines for fulfilling requests, things like that. But you can also have a very detailed one. If you'd prefer to have a more detailed sunshine law policy, that's up to the body. You can have one if you'd like. I think the City of Columbia has a pretty in-depth one that they have on their website if you'd like to look at it. It's something like 20 pages long. So it is a bit of a read, but you can go through that. Ours is on page 15 in the booklet if you want to take a look at that. Okay. Here is my contact information. And of course, I went ahead and sent this to Jason. So anybody who wants a copy of the presentation can get a copy. Anybody in the public who wants a copy of the presentation, just send me an email, let me know, stop by, and I'll send you a copy as well. This link at the bottom here, if you get it electronically, takes you to our publications page so that you can order booklets if you'd like them. It also takes you to the publications for everything that our office does. So if you need booklets for, anything else, know your rights, landlord, tenant, things like that, those are all available for free as well. And questions? Okay. I can actually hear the crickets outside. So
Casey, I've got
that's
another one.
Yeah.
I wonder about the use of private services for communication for government bodies.
Okay.
So like if I send something from my private email or my private phone, a text from my private phone, and I copy all the members of the council, and it's about government business. So somebody has a right to that record, right? Well, the real question is, does that make me susceptible to all the records that I have on that private device?
Okay, so the question was on a private device, would your private device then become a semi-public device if you used it to conduct public business?
Right.
And the answer is generally no, because it is not paid for by the public governmental body. They don't maintain it in any way. 610025 has you sending it to the clerk so that you can do that. It doesn't automatically make your text to your family and friends open to the public. Your records are still the records of the public governmental body. So anything you send to the council, it's a quorum. If you're just responding, hey guys, sorry, I'm running late, I'll be there in 10 minutes, that kind of transitory document, those would be records the body can be copied on. However, I can't say that that won't stop a subpoena to search your phone.
That's where I was going, yeah. So
Ah.
legally, they might go after other stuff on your device.
I don't know about the other stuff on your device, because again, I can't speak to how any particular discovery request or subpoena would be drafted and what they would be after. The device, though, is still yours. So this came up a lot back in the aughts. Bring your own device was a very big issue for local entities, mainly because nobody had the money to pay for devices for council members that may only be serving anywhere from 2 to 10 years. There are some options, and this is not me like speaking for any options or saying anything is better than another product. But I do know that school districts will sometimes use an app that they have their staff download, and then messages are sent to the app, and all business is conducted through that application on the phone, which means the application is sending everything automatically for storage at the school. So that way, teachers can use their own devices. Schools aren't spending money on that type of device. They pay for the app and the storage. I do believe there are things like that. I'm not sure, what they are exactly, like each individual type. But I do know there are some products out there if that's something, any city is considering. I do know our office has a very strict, you conduct business on business devices and personal on personal devices. So it feels clunky to walk around with 2 phones, but it's what we have to do. So it's interesting. I understand why BYOD for bring your own device was a big issue, but I think we're seeing some of the fallout from it in the last 10 years. So. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you again so much. Thank you to Crystal City for hosting. Thank you to Festus for joining us electronically. I know Zoom meetings can start to drag a bit, so thank you all for hanging in there. I appreciate it. And for all of you who came out, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
If you want to go ahead and entertain a motion to adjourn. So moved.
Second. Motion's been made and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed say nay. Hearing none, motion carries. This work